Okay, I know you're never supposed to start a presentation with an apology, but I'm going to start a presentation with an apology because, as you can see, I have a French name, and I'm here in France giving a presentation, but my French name is from my paternal lineage, and my grandfather came to the US at a time where you became American by only speaking English. So while he's been kind enough to instruct me in a whole range of French insults, that's the limit of my French right now. So I'm delighted to be here. I'm honored to talk to you today. I'm going to present some of my research on intergroup empathy and dehumanization. So my research program has been inspired and informed by my personal experiences before I became a scientist. Over a number of years, I traveled, worked, and lived in a number of regions around the world, and I just happened to find myself in these conflict regions during times of conflict. So I was in South Africa when it transitioned from apartheid to democracy. I was in Sri Lanka for one of the largest Tamil tiger strikes in that country's civil war. I was in Ireland during the Troubles there, volunteering at a conflict resolution camp, and I've spent now a lot of time in both Israel and the West Bank. So what was really striking to me about these conflicts is that despite the fact that they differ across almost every dimension you can imagine, they involve completely different religions, different languages, different histories, different geographies. They're on 3 different continents. What I was struck by was how similar the processes seem to be in the minds of the people who are engaged in conflict. So it was the psychologies of the conflict that seemed to be remarkably similar. And the way I've come to think of it is that it seems like there are a number of psychological processes that are pulling people towards political violence, towards conflict. And there are a number of psychological forces that are drawing people away from conflict. Likewise, there are similar forces. There are a set of forces that are driving people towards helping the other group and a number of forces that are pulling people away from helping the other group. So I'm going to talk about 2 such forces that I think play a key role in intergroup conflict that I've been studying for a number of years. One is empathy and one is dehumanization. So the classic view of empathy is that empathy is this impediment to harming. Right? Very clear cut. People with more empathy are less likely to harm others. And that people with more empathy are more likely to help others. So in interpersonal contexts, we often talk about a particular flavor of empathy called empathic concern. That is how much concern you feel for the suffering of others. And we measure this with personality measures like the Interpersonal Reactivity Index that includes items like this. I often have tender, concerned feelings for people less fortunate than me. When I see someone being taken advantage of, I feel kind of protective towards them. So people who answer higher on these types of items are said to have more trait empathic concern. People who answer lower, less trait empathic concern. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence suggesting that in interpersonal contexts, higher empathic concern predicts more helping. So for example, people who are already volunteers at a food bank, the people who have higher empathic concern will tend to stay longer in that volunteer position. They'll devote more of their time to helping others. But the big question for me is this the same in intergroup contexts? Certainly in the media, we're given evidence that it's the same. We know that, for example, in movies, the Arabs who commit violence against others, the terrorists are generally sociopaths who lack empathy for anybody. But I think this view really needs to be reconciled with some of the realities on the ground. And for me, here's one really nice example of a counterpoint. That is Wafa Idris. So Wafa Idris was a Palestinian woman. She was a paramedic. She volunteered with families to deliver relief supplies to children during the Intifada. She played with their children. She was basically a babysitter, a volunteer, a paramedic. She was also the first female Palestinian suicide bomber. So the interesting thing about this is, by all accounts, you would have to categorize Wafa Idris as an empath rather than a sociopath. So what is going on here? And first of all, I want to say that this isn't just an isolated incident. People who go and interview people who have attempted suicide bombings, whose vest didn't explode, for example, when they characterize the people they interview, they characterize them by, if anything, a lot of empathy. So what's happening here? Well, I propose that, that more important than the amount of empathy or the capacity you have for empathy, in intergroup contexts, it might be how you distribute empathy between in-group and out-group. So whereas out-group empathy would prevent you from harming the out-group, in-group empathy actually might influence you to harm the out-group. In Wafa Idris's case, she cited all the Palestinian children that were suffering as her motivation to go commit violence. So the big problem would happen then if you have a lot of in-group empathy pulling you towards violence and very little out-group empathy holding you back from violence. What I call parochial empathy, or the difference between these, might be the best measure of support for political violence, and also the best predictor of whether someone will withhold aid towards the out-group. So I've tested this in a couple of different contexts. Here's one. I had a number of American participants log on and take part in an online paradigm. In this paradigm, I told them that we were interested in how the language you learn determines how you process information. And I told them they would be taking part in a bunch of directional problem-solving tasks. These are Raven's matrices, for those of you who are familiar with them. And then I told them that they would be playing as a group of Americans who learn language from left to right against a group of Arabs who learn language from right to left. And I wanted to see if there's a difference between them. I then said that scientific evidence suggests that learning more about the people you're playing with and against helps with this particular task. And that let me show them a bunch of these little stories. After they shared their own misfortune that had happened to them recently, they read these little misfortunes that happens to in-group and out-group members. And for each one, they just reported how good and how bad does it make you feel that this happened to them. And we took as our measure of empathy how bad people felt about bad things happening to somebody else. So they had a number of these stories about in-group and out-group members, and at the end, we had a measure of in-group empathy, and we had a measure of out-group empathy. And then after they finished these directional problem-solving tasks, we gave them the opportunity to do a bunch more, this time for charity. Specifically, it was for an Arab charity, the Arab Red Crescent Society. So they could do as many or as few as they wanted, and our question was, what predicts how much time they will spend working for this charity? So the two predictors we had, of course, now are trait empathic concern. They also filled out how empathic they are as people using the items that I showed you at the beginning. And parochial empathy was the distribution of empathy between one and the other. And on the y-axis here, I have outgroup altruism, how many of these extra problems they were willing to do for an Arab charity. The first thing I found is that the amount of trait empathic concern they had, the amount they self-reported that they care about needy members, needy people, did not predict how altruistic they were towards outgroup members. But the distribution of empathy between in-group and out-group did. I replicated this in a second study, got a very similar result, and for these participants, I actually had them come back a week later and looked at some other outcome measures, because I wanted to see whether this is truly in-group empathy pulling in one direction and out-group empathy pulling in the other. So what I'll show you here is just a simultaneous regression for two new outcomes a week later with these same participants, and I'll ask whether out-group empathy is pulling in one direction, predicting in one way, and in-group empathy is pulling in the other. And what I found was that both for the amount of Arabs they were willing to allow to immigrate to the US and their actual willingness to donate to civilian victims of drone strikes in Yemen, that out-group empathy was a strong predictor for both of these, but so was in-group empathy, and it was almost equal. So these seem to be pulling in opposite directions. The second context that I've looked at parochial empathy in is during the refugee crisis, and of course, this played out pretty dramatically in Hungary, so I've focused a lot of my research in Hungary. And I think there's good reason to think that both in-group empathy and out-group empathy could be driving attitudes there. We have a lot of images of the suffering of the refugees that I'm sure people in Hungary are exposed to that might be pulling them towards delivering aid. But there are also statements made by a lot of the politicians, the high-level politicians in Hungary, this by Orban, no ideology or economic interest of any kind should allow us to risk the lives of European citizens. So citing the concern for European citizens as a reason why we shouldn't accept refugees in. So for this sample, this is a representative sample of Hungarians. I presented them with a large survey that included a bunch of these items that are similar to the ones that I used in the first study. That is, a number of scenarios about misfortunes happening to people. And for one set of these, I paired them with Hungarian targets, and for the other set of stories, I paired them with refugee targets. And which set was paired with Hungarians or refugees was just counterbalanced across participant. So this, again, gives me a measure of in-group empathy and a measure of out-group empathy, and I can ask, do people with greater disparities in in-group versus out-group empathy, does this drive their behavior towards refugees? So the one outcome measure I have here is how many people, how many refugees they think should be granted asylum into Hungary. I also had items like their willingness to sign a petition to support refugees, and the results of that are almost identical to this one. So what I'll show here is, again, the beta, so how strongly it predicts asylum when I include all three of these simultaneously into a regression, and then the p-value. What I found was that trait empathic concern, after considering in-group and out-group empathy separately, trait empathic concern, again, had no predictive value for how many refugees they thought should be allowed into their country, whereas out-group empathy and in-group empathy independently predicted this in opposite directions. So in all, trait empathic concern, there's a lot of evidence showing that in interpersonal contexts, this is a very good predictor of behavior. But in intergroup contexts, where there's some kind of conflict, where there's a perception that there's a zero-sum relationship between the groups, it really doesn't seem to be the amount or the capacity for empathy that's predicting. Rather, it's the distribution of empathy between in-group and out-group. So the second process that I've been really focused on is dehumanization. Historically, dehumanization has been associated with all sorts of extreme nastiness. We heard some of it from Itzhak in the introduction. It's been associated with colonization, with the extermination of other groups, and it's been associated with war. And the idea here is that dehumanization, so normally we have moral prohibitions against harming others. But the key factor in this moral prohibition against harm is it only applies to humans. So the idea is if you have a perception of outgroup humanity, then that'll prevent you from harming other human beings. But if you compromise that view that they're actually human, it removes some of those moral prohibitions. And this is the term coined here by Al Bandura a number of years ago, is that dehumanizing others morally disengages us from their suffering. So there have been a number of ways that dehumanization have been measured over the years. In social psychology, there's been basically a tacit assumption that the blatant dehumanization from our colonial past kind of echoes forward to today, and we might be able to see echoes of that in really subtle levels of dehumanization. And I think the cleverest version of this is this idea of infrahumanization, an idea of trying to get at how much people dehumanize by giving them a very subtle measure that they might not be aware of. So in this measure, you basically just ask people how well a series of emotions describe another group, say an out-group or the in-group. And the typical finding from this, so you'll notice, that some of these are positive and some of these are negative. Everybody's going to notice that. But the really key distinction here for dehumanization is that some of these are primary emotions that humans tend to share with animals, like fear and anger. And the other set are secondary emotions that are more human-specific. We think of humans being more characterized by embarrassment and jealousy than animals. And so the typical finding from this is that people will reserve secondary emotions more for their in-group than the out-group. And this is a representation of dehumanization. And indeed, when I ask Hungarians about these items, when I ask them to characterize Hungarian, ethnic majority Hungarians and Roma, I find that they're pretty equal in their attribution of primary emotions to both groups, but that they withhold these secondary emotions to their own group and deny them to the Roma. Another way to measure this in very subtle ways is with an implicit association test. So I developed one of these, again, for Hungarians. And in this one, I just showed them either Roma faces or ethnic majority Hungarian faces, and then showed them words that were associated with animals or humans. And the idea here is if Hungarian face or human word are paired on the left, when a face or a word comes up into the center of the screen, if it's a Hungarian face or a human word, you press the left button on your keypad as quickly as possible. And if it belongs to one of the other two categories, Roma or animal, you press the right button. And if this is the task and you flash the words on the screen, Hungarians are very fast at doing this. But when you switch, and so now Hungarian face and animal word are just paired on the left, their reaction time drops dramatically by about 25%. And this results in a very strong IAT bias. So this is an implicit bias that people have that's very strong in Hungary that's associated with dehumanization. Okay, but I think there's strong reason to believe that blatant dehumanization is not just a relic of our colonial past. In fact, if you open the newspaper, you often see images like this. Here from a British newspaper depicting refugees as mice and rats, and here from an American newspaper depicting ISIS as cancer. And in fact, if you step just a step outside of the strong political correctness norms, you start to find quotes like these. So this is from Hungary. This is Zsolt Bayer, the founder of Hungary's ruling party, talking about the Roma. They're not fit to live among people. These Roma are animals, and they behave like animals. They're incapable of human communication. Inarticulate sounds pour out of their bestial skulls. Should be allowed to exist in no way. That needs to be solved immediately and regardless of method. So, of course, it seems like this quote could have easily been taken from 1930s Germany, right? So, and this wasn't just a hot mic moment. This was a published editorial in a major Hungarian newspaper, and just a couple of years ago. And you see similar quotes all over the place. Here's one from the Israeli Deputy Defense Minister: "To me, Palestinians are like animals, they aren't human." So these are very blatant expressions of dehumanization. So the question I had with some colleagues was, can we actually get people to cop to their blatant dehumanization? And does this blatant dehumanization actually predict things in the real world now, today, not 60 years ago? So we developed this measure that is completely offensive and totally overt. We just present people with the ascent of man diagram and list a bunch of groups underneath, and we ask them just simply to drag a slider over until it indicates how evolved and civilized they feel like each of these groups are to them. And what we find, here's the mean response among the representative sample of Hungarians, that they judge Muslims and the Roma to be significantly less evolved and civilized than their own group. 29 points on this 100-point scale. And I've now looked at this across Europe. So certainly it's very strong in Hungary, but it's almost equal in Greece and in Spain. And I've gone beyond that to again focus on the refugee crisis. Here is the response for Muslims in these three countries, but it's not limited there. We have data from Denmark and from the Netherlands and from England. And in all of these places, you can see there's a pretty significant mean level of dehumanization across all of these groups. And when we look at refugees, we also find pretty significant levels. Okay, so what are the consequences of this? Sure, people might report these mean levels, but does it mean anything? Does it predict anything? So here is a sample of Hungarian pre-service school teachers, the people who you think would have the lowest levels of these. I had them come into the lab, and while in the lab, they did the implicit association test I showed you. They did the Infrahumanization measure, and they also reported this blatant dehumanization, and then they registered their support for a number of discriminatory policies against the Roma. And what I found was that blatant dehumanization was a really strong predictor, even taking account of these other dehumanization measures. And in fact, the more subtle measures didn't do anything to predict this behavior. I've actually done this with a behavioral paradigm where Roma teachers place students into different tracks. And I find that the bias in how they track students is also predicted by blatant dehumanization and not by the subtle forms of dehumanization. And here's a Hungarian representative sample again. So this is now with refugees. Again, the number of refugees that are accepted. And here I'm controlling for parochial empathy and conservatism. We know that conservatism should predict this. We find that the best predictor is still blatant dehumanization, and parochial empathy is an independent predictor along with conservatism. So these are independent predictors that are driving people to accept refugees into their country or not. Okay, so one big question about this measure is that it seems totally reasonable that people could just be using it to express their extreme dislike for another group. If that's all you give them, then sure, they'll express their extreme dislike. So I think some evidence that this isn't the case might come if you use both dislike and dehumanization as predictors and see if they're separate from each other. But I think really compelling evidence would be if they were cognitively distinct, if when people were making these judgments, they were using totally separate neural mechanisms. And so I did a neuroimaging study specifically to test this. Very simply, I had Americans come into the scanner, and I allowed them to use sequentially these scales to rate these groups. And so the scale would appear, one of the groups would appear, and then they'd make a continuous rating to rate how evolved and civilized or how much they liked or disliked with the feeling thermometer. And you can see that these groups are high status groups, low status groups, and animals. And so what we're looking for are brain regions that respond in a way that would suggest animalistic dehumanization. And what we found was that at the individual level, we looked for brain regions that were more responsive the more they dehumanized the other group. So for that individual, if they rated groups, for the groups that they rated lower, what brain region responds more? And we found a couple of brain regions. One of them here, I think, is significant because it went by quickly, but the study by Jean Dissetti showing that when people are killing soldiers versus civilians, you actually get strong activity in precisely this brain region. So suggesting that soldiers might be more dehumanized than civilians in this video game. This is converging evidence for that. So the mean responses in this brain region were also suggestive of animalistic dehumanization. So when we define the region by its parametric sensitivity to dehumanization, when we then extracted and looked at the mean responses, we found that the mean responses were much lower for high status groups than they were for low status groups and animals, and low status groups and animals were indistinguishable from each other. By contrast, when people were making increasing judgments of liking, only one brain region was significantly activated, and this is in a brain region of the posterior cingulate cortex that was distinct from this area of dehumanization. So there was no overlap between the two activities. This was a double dissociation in making judgments of dehumanization and dislike. So finally, how consequential is this for real-world politics? I showed you some of the data for the Roma and for refugees, but I also took it to the American context. This was around the time last fall when Americans were trying to decide what to do about the Iranian nuclear crisis. Right? Should we sign an accord or should we attack Iran and kill a lot of people? And my question was, does dehumanization play into this decision-making beyond people's conservatism, beyond their party allegiance? So we have the mean level of dehumanization is there. With the nuclear deal, the question is, does this affect them? And we have anecdotal evidence that this might play a role. There was a lot of dehumanizing kind of language around Iranians. This picture here was published a couple of years ago in Iowa. It depicts Iran as a sewer and Iranians presumably as cockroaches scurrying down it. So here's what we found. Now, here I'm showing blatant dehumanization versus subtle dehumanization. Here I'm including prejudice. So they're rating on the feeling thermometer, how warm or cold they feel towards Iranians, and conservatism. And what I found was that blatant dehumanization predicted all of these things: opposition to the accord, support for aggression, and their willingness to sign petitions to that effect. Subtle dehumanization did nothing, and surprisingly, prejudice, once you included dehumanization, also did nothing, and conservatism was still a strong predictor. But I think this is significant. We know this is a highly partisan issue, but above and beyond that, blatant dehumanization was a really strong predictor. So blatant dehumanization is prevalent. I've shown you some of the samples that I've used towards the Roma, towards Muslims, towards Iranians. This is actually just a small subset of all of the samples that we've now done. And for all of these samples, blatant dehumanization predicts every hostile attitude and behavioral outcome we've ever included. It does it better than subtle dehumanization, and for 90% of the outcomes, it's still true controlling for prejudice. It's also true controlling for social dominance orientation and right-wing authoritarianism. Blatant humanization is also highly consequential for the nuclear deal, for attitudes on poverty, immigration issues. What drives it? So I think this is the last hopeful message that I'll finish up with. So the first part is not particularly hopeful. That is that we know that meta-perceptions, what you think another group thinks of you, are strong motivators. We know that meta-prejudice leads to our own prejudice. If we think somebody else hates us, then we tend to not like them very much. We thought that meta-dehumanization might be a process that actually drives dehumanization, that if you think another group dehumanizes you, if you think they think of you as infidels, that you might dehumanize them in turn. And so we tested this in a number of contexts. Here's an independent sample of Americans considering Iranians, meta-dehumanization. And the idea is meta-dehumanization would lead to reactive dehumanization, which would then precipitate aggression, and that this would be separate from a pathway of dislike, meta-prejudice to reactive prejudice. So in a formal model, this is what it looks like. And what we found from this data is that indeed meta-dehumanization and meta-prejudice, how much you think they dehumanize you and how much they think they dislike you, are independent predictors directly of aggression towards Iranians, and that both of these are mediated by driving outgroup dehumanization and driving outgroup prejudice. So these are separate pathways that lead to aggression towards Iranians. And the hopeful part is that this perception that we have, that Americans have, that Muslims dehumanize Americans, is actually quite strong. So this is a sample of American students who are engaged in a cross-cultural online dialogue program. And for them, they think that Iranians dehumanize Americans 35 points on that ascent of man scale. But here's the actual data from people in the Muslim world. The highest response we've ever gotten is less than half of that. And that's of Palestinians during the Gaza war, when they viewed Americans as partially responsible. And the lowest response we've gotten is by Lebanese, who view themselves as less evolved and civilized than Americans. And the data coming from Pew surveys over the last 20 years suggests that this is actually true, that people in the Muslim world actually have a huge amount of respect for Americans and the US. And so what we did is we wanted to see, okay, well, since there's this big disparity in what Americans perceive and what exists, and since this drives reactive dehumanization, can we decrease perceived meta-dehumanization to decrease dehumanization? So we just presented people with this fake news article, and we populated it with information from what Muslims actually think about Americans, including common responses from the Muslim world, Americans' technological advancement, psychological form of, sophisticated form of checks and balances, etc. We just gave them the information that's already out there. And the question was, versus control participants who didn't see any article, would meta-dehumanization decrease their reactive dehumanization? And indeed, this was the case, that it dropped it by quite a bit if you just presented people with the actual information. Unfortunately, the reverse was also true. And I think this is the type of message that we often get from the American media. So in sum, I think of the processes going on in the brain that might be driving people to conflict as a series of pulls in opposite directions, some of them preventing people from committing violence against the other group, and some of them pulling towards that violence. And I've presented evidence for a couple of these processes that are probably involved in this tug of war. So thanks to collaborators on this work and the funders who've made it possible. And I actually have no idea how much time I have. I don't have the timekeeper up here, but if there's any time for questions, I'm of course happy to take them. Thanks.